Scientists have made a groundbreaking discovery, the bones of what looked to be a new human-like species.
Researchers just pulled a genetic thread that unravels the entire history of ancient Mexico and the Aztecs. By looking at ancient DNA, they found traces of people that should not be there, according to the standard version of history. This discovery brings us face to face with a reality where ancient explorers crossed the sea way earlier than we thought. It is the kind of stuff Graham Hancock has been talking about for decades.
I mentioned them briefly. It's considered to be the earliest high culture of Central America. Everybody's heard about the Aztecs.
And now the science is catching up. This is not just a small detail. It is a complete shift in how we see our past. Silent witnesses. Over thousands of years, these groups adapted to new climates and landscapes, as hunters became farmers and camps became villages. Villages eventually became cities, and within this model, everything followed a straight line with no sudden leaps or missing chapters. That is where the Aztecs entered the story, since they appeared late. Very late. The Mexica people founded Tenochtitlan in 1325 on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco. Compared to older civilizations like Egypt or the Maya, they seemed like newcomers, and yet, almost immediately, they were building something extraordinary. In less than 200 years, the Aztecs created a massive capital city that was larger than most European cities of the time. They engineered causeways and aqueducts while tracking the movements of the sun and stars with perfect accuracy. They developed complex calendars and an empire that dominated central Mexico. Historians explained this speed by saying the Aztecs stood on the shoulders of giants and borrowed knowledge from earlier cultures. It was a reasonable explanation, but it never fully explained the whole story or the sheer organization of their society. Cities were planned with precision, and marketplaces operated like clockwork, while specialized craftsmen and scribes maintained complex systems. The level of coordination required did not seem to come from nowhere, but hinted at layers of influence long forgotten. The empire expanded rapidly, yet it maintained togetherness across hundreds of miles. Historians struggled to explain how such focused power could emerge so quickly in a society supposedly just arriving. How did so much hard-to-understand stuff appear so fast? Why did their rise feel like a giant jump instead of a slow climb? The official answer was that it was all due to spreading out and time, and for decades, it went unchallenged until scientists began looking at the DNA. But here is the catch. The Aztecs told stories about a place called Aztlan, a mysterious island home they left behind. They said they were guided by a god to find an eagle on a cactus. Most people thought this was just a neat story, but what if it was a memory of a real place that was lost? The crazy part is that their engineering was so good, it almost seemed like they had a manual from a much older world. They built their city on a lake, using giant wooden piles driven 25 feet into the mud. They created floating gardens that could feed hundreds of thousands of people. This kind of tech does not usually just pop up overnight. Some people like Graham Hancock think this is proof of a lost civilization that taught the Aztecs how to build. He thinks they were the survivors of a global disaster that happened 10,000 years before. Hands down, the Aztecs were some of the best builders in history, but the question remains of where that spark of genius actually came from. If they were just simple hunters a few generations before, how did they learn to map the stars so well? They knew exactly when the seasons would change and how to build pyramids that lined up with the sun. It is not that simple, though, because the deeper we dig, the more we find that the land was already full of ghosts. Something very strange was hiding in the genetic code of the oldest people in the rainforest. Hidden roots of Mexico. When scientists began studying the DNA of ancient people in the Americas, they expected the story to be simple. For decades, the main idea was that the first humans crossed into the continent from Siberia and slowly spread south. But in 2015, That idea broke when a team found a small but clear genetic trace that matched people from the other side of the world. The closest match was not Siberia or East Asia, but Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians. At first, every researcher assumed it had to be a mistake, or maybe a dirty sample. But more tests kept confirming the same thing, because the signal was real and it was old. It was more than 15,000 years old, long before the Aztecs or any known city in Mexico. This meant at least one ancient group reached the Americas in a way no one had ever considered. The signal did not appear everywhere, but survived in some regions and vanished in others. This is important because the Aztecs were not living on an untouched continent. They arrived in a land shaped by layer after layer of older movements from distant places. As more DNA from ancient remains is compared, scientists are starting to notice faint overlaps. The continent was a mixing ground for people long before the Aztecs ever showed up. Recent studies of DNA passed down through mothers show that Mexico was a spreading point where family lines appear in populations far to the north and south. Ancient DNA is found all the way in Chile and Argentina, which means Mexico shaped populations across the entire hemisphere. The Aztecs arrived late, but they inherited this mixed family tree. Their empire expanded over regions already shaped by centuries of moving around. Conquests did not just redraw borders, but they changed the DNA of the people they ruled. Families were moved, and local groups were mixed with the Aztecs. This genetic mixing also shows the power of ancient cities as living labs of human connection. People and ideas flowed across valleys and trade routes, but certain father lines, the Y chromosomes of earlier civilizations, mostly go away. Father lines from older groups are almost gone in modern populations, which hints at big troubles or replacements. The continent was always being remade, and the Aztecs became one of the last groups to leave their mark. And get this, some of these lost fathers might have been part of the very civilization Graham Hancock talks about. He thinks there was a group of people who traveled the world during the Ice Age. If they were moving around the oceans, they could have easily left their DNA in places like the Amazon or Mexico. This would explain why we see genetic links to Australia in the middle of a jungle. It sounds like science fiction, but the data is right there in the blood. Basically, the history books are missing a huge part of the puzzle. The Aztecs were walking on top of a world that had already seen many rises and falls. They were the ones who finally put the pieces back together into a giant empire. But even they might not have known about the ancient cousins who arrived by sea thousands of years before them. What most people do not realize is that the DNA is showing us a map of the world that we completely forgot about. It shows that the oceans were not walls, but highways for people who were much smarter than we give them credit for. The men who built the first great cities seemed to vanish into thin air. Words that built an empire. When the Aztecs expanded their power, they did not rely only on warriors, since they carried something far more effective, which was their words. Nahuatl became one of the strongest tools they used to pull distant regions into their world. Early Spanish accounts describe how people across huge distances already understood and used the language when the Europeans first arrived. Traders spoke it, and messengers used it, while marketplaces from the border of Texas to central Mexico echoed with it. Even some coastal groups near California had learned parts of it through trade routes that stretched farther than most imagined. Nahuatl worked like a bridge that moved ideas and stories from one place to another. And wherever the language traveled, people traveled with it as families, and craftsmen moved across valleys and mountains. DNA now confirms what these old reports hinted at, because regions connected by trade paths show signs of mixing. Mother lines blend in places where the Aztecs built strong trade networks. This matches how the Aztecs ruled, since they did not try to erase every culture, but took them in. By spreading their language, they made it easier to collect money and bring new groups into their system. Some local family lines faded out over time, while others joined the new social groups built around the empire. But the deeper researchers look, the stranger the picture becomes. Nahuatl words and symbols have been found carved on things far away from the main cities. This suggests that the movement of people and ideas started long before the empire was even a thing. These clues raise new questions about the civilizations that came before the Aztecs. How many groups spread their languages across the region before them? How many communities disappeared and left only tiny marks in carvings and DNA? Behind every shared word lies a deeper pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once scientists track the DNA. It is a pattern that shows not only mixing, but sudden breaks in entire male lines that simply go away. The DNA shows that many male lines, the Y chromosomes that trace father to son, simply vanished. Entire male family lines disappeared from the record at times of trouble. Everyone is obsessed with the idea of a lost city of gold, but the real treasure is the information hidden in these languages. Some linguists have found strange links between Nahuatl and languages from other parts of the world. For starters, there are words that sound very similar to ancient languages from across the sea. If the language was moving, the genes were moving too. This fits perfectly with the idea that the Aztecs were part of a global web of survivors. They were using a language that had been building up for thousands of years. They were not just making it up as they went. They were using the tools of the ancestors to build a brand new world. But here is the crazy part. If the language was that old, it means the trade routes were also that old. People were walking from the Great Lakes all the way down to Mexico to trade copper and chocolate. This was a massive network of human life that we are only just starting to map out with DNA. The Aztecs were the masters of this network, but they did not build the roads. They just took them over and made them run like clockwork. The history of the world is actually written in the blood of the survivors, proving the forbidden history. The Aztecs were not the first to settle in the Valley of Mexico, as cities had risen and fallen long before they arrived on the scene as a wandering tribe. Yet something amazing happened when they came. Because DNA shows they stepped into a world already broken, a landscape littered with the skeletal remains of high civilizations that had collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Their late arrival gave them a strange edge since they were able to get power quickly by acting as the ultimate opportunists of history. They married into surviving mother lines and took in scattered populations to change the genetic map of the region almost overnight. Every conquest left a mark by blending people and genes into a growing empire that was as much a biological project as it was a political one. But the Aztec influence was not just local, since their conquests created waves that stretched far across the land, reaching deep into the jungles and up into the northern deserts. Genetics confirms what history books hint at, because the empire was biological as much as it was political. Groups were moved systematically across the landscape, which left a lasting mark on the people themselves that we can still read today like a map. Their language impact matches this genetic reach, as Nahuatl spread widely as a common way to talk, a lingua franca that united disparate tribes under a single cosmic vision. This was not just talking, but was culture and identity put into daily life through the medium of blood and speech. The Aztecs knew how to bring others in while keeping their own ways, which made things feel stable in a world that had known only chaos for centuries. Yet while their power is big, the DNA also shows traces of what they got from others, including signals that shouldn't exist according to standard history. The Australian signals and mother lines from earlier groups all flowed into the Aztec people, suggesting a much deeper and more complex ancestry than a simple migration from the north. Their empire became a living picture of centuries of moving and survival, a genetic archive of a humanity that had been crossing oceans for millennia. By looking at these patterns, scientists can see how the Aztecs did not just win by force, but completed a puzzle. They stepped into a world of missing stories and filled in the blanks to leave a trail of culture that pointed toward a forgotten global past. This deep genetic story leads to one big realization. The Aztecs were the ones who took over a hidden world, acting as the final curators of a museum of human achievement that was already thousands of years old. They put together the pieces of civilizations that came before them and connected the past to the future in a way that modern archaeology is only now beginning to grasp. History is not only written in ruins, but is also put into our very DNA, where each missing line tells a story of survival against impossible odds. The Aztecs did not just build an empire, they connected lost groups to the living world and preserved a legacy of advanced knowledge. The Americas have a history that is far more mixed and mysterious than anyone ever thought, pointing toward a global network of trade and travel that existed while Europe was still in the dark. We are finding that Graham Hancock was right to ask about the simple stories we were told in school, as the reality is far more wild than the fiction. The maps and the stars and the DNA all point to a global past that was forgotten by time, a period where humanity was unified by a shared science of the heavens. What most people do not realize is that the Aztecs might have been the last keepers of this ancient knowledge, inherited from the old ones who survived the great cataclysms of the past. They built pyramids that were perfectly lined up with the stars, just like the ones in Egypt, using a system of measurement that remains consistent across the globe. They had a calendar that was more accurate than the one used in Europe at the time, tracking cycles of time that spanned millions of years. Where did they get this math? If they were just moving around as small groups a few hundred years before, they would not have had time to figure out the secrets of the universe from scratch. This is why the wild theories are starting to look more like facts to those willing to look at the data. The DNA is the final proof that people were crossing oceans and sharing secrets long before we thought it was possible, carrying the blueprints of civilization in their very cells. The Aztecs were the final chapter of a story that started at the end of the last ice age, a story of a high-tech maritime culture that was wiped out by a comet impact. They were the ones who carried the torch until the very end, preserving the sacred geometry and the celestial alignments that defined the pre-cataclysmic world. They were the guardians of a forbidden history, a lineage of survivors who knew that the world had ended before and would likely end again. Is it possible that we are just now waking up to our true history? The Aztecs didn't just stumble upon the ruins of Teotihuacan. They recognized them as the work of the gods and sought to revive the spirit of that lost age. They saw themselves as the successors to a lineage of giants, a term that may actually refer to the intellectual and technological stature of their predecessors. By analyzing the structural similarities between Aztec monuments and those found in the Fertile Crescent, we see a recurring theme of world mountain architecture. This suggests a shared blueprint, a core set of instructions handed down by a survivor class of sages who traveled the world after the great floods to restart civilization. The Aztecs were the last great work of these survivors, a final attempt to anchor human consciousness to the stars before the memory of the Golden Age faded into myth. For centuries, the story of ancient Mexico seemed to be one of isolation, a world cut off from the rest of humanity until the Spanish arrived. But the DNA has shattered that myth, revealing a vibrant, interconnected web of life that spanned the Pacific and the Atlantic, long before Columbus was even a thought. The presence of the Australasian signal in South America and the complex mixing in Mexico show that the world was always connected by daring explorers who navigated by the stars. The Aztecs were the masters of a land that had seen the rise and fall of giants, inheriting a landscape that was already saturated with the energy of thousands of years of human endeavor. When they built their pyramids, they were following a blueprint that might be tens of thousands of years old, using sacred ratios that resonate with the frequency of the Earth itself. Graham Hancock's idea of a lost civilization is no longer just a theory. It is becoming a biological reality as we sequence the genomes of the ancient past. The vanishing male lines tell us that something happened, a great reset that wiped away the leaders of the old world and left a genetic vacuum. But the women survived, and they carried the genetic memory of those lost civilizations into the heart of the Aztec Empire, ensuring that the ancient wisdom would not be totally lost. This means that the people living today in Mexico and Central America are the direct link to a global past that included high seas navigation and advanced agriculture. They carry the blood of explorers who crossed the Pacific Ocean when the world was still covered in ice, bringing with them the seeds of civilization. They carry the language of a trade network that spanned entire continents, a system of exchange that moved not just goods, but ideas and genes. The Aztecs were not just a flash in the pan. They were the result of a long, deep history of survival against the elements and against the erasure of time. Their laws, their art, and their science were the culmination of thousands of years of human experience, refined and distilled into a single powerful state. When we look at the ruins of Tenochtitlan, we are looking at the final version of an ancient dream, a dream of a world where humanity was connected by the stars and the seas. The crazy part is that we are only just beginning to decode this information, peeling back the layers of propaganda and time to see the truth. Every year, new DNA studies come out that push the date of human arrival in the Americas further back into the deep past. First, it was 15,000 years, then 20,000, and now some say 30,000 years ago, during the height of the last glacial period. This changes everything because it means the first Americans weren't just hunters chasing mammoths, but sophisticated people capable of surviving in a frozen world. It means the Aztecs were part of a story that is as old as human civilization in itself, a story of resilience and adaptation on a global scale. They were not the beginning, and they were not a side story. They were a central part of a global history that was nearly erased by the victors of later wars. The things we find in the ground and the things we find in our blood are finally telling the same tale of a lost world. It is a tale of a world that was lost to fire and flood, but is now being found again through the power of science and a healthy dose of curiosity. We are finally seeing the Aztecs for who they really were, the guardians of a legacy that belongs to all of us, a legacy of cosmic awareness and terrestrial mastery. Their obsession with blood and sacrifice, often viewed as savage, might have been a misunderstood attempt to manipulate the very life force or spirit energy that the ancients believed held the universe together. If they inherited the science of a civilization that understood the quantum nature of reality, then their rituals take on a completely different, albeit darker, meaning. What if the pyramids were not just symbols of power, but actual machines designed to interact with the Earth's ionosphere? Some theories suggest that the specific layering of mica and mercury found in Mexican pyramids mirrors the components of modern energy conductors. The Aztecs may have been trying to restart the engines of the gods, using the fragments of knowledge they had left to tap into the fundamental forces of nature. Their fascination with gold was not for its monetary value, but for its unique conductive properties, a remnant of a time when metallurgy was a sacred science of energy. This would explain why they were so focused on the precise geometry of their cities. They were building a circuit board on a continental scale. The genetic Australasian signal is the smoking gun of this theory, proving that the ancient world was a place of constant movement and high-level interaction. If people from the other side of the planet were in the Americas tens of thousands of years ago, then our entire timeline of human development is wrong. It means there was a common era of humanity that existed before the recorded history of Sumer or Egypt. The Aztecs were the final bastion of this era, the last people to hold the line before the modern world took over. They were the ones who remembered that the stars dictate the fate of empires, and they watched the heavens with a precision that we are only now beginning to match with our most advanced computers. Is it possible that our ancestors were more connected than we ever dreamed, and that the Aztecs were the last ones to hold the map to that connection? Their stories of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, who brought wisdom from across the sea, are not mere myths, but historical accounts of contact with the survivors of the global civilization. This figure, often described as white-skinned and bearded, appears in various forms across all American cultures, always as a bringer of science and law. He was likely a representative of the maritime kings, the ones who mapped the world and left the genetic markers we see today. The Aztecs were his students, the ones who took his lessons and built a world of wonders in the middle of a lake. By embracing these wild theories, we begin to see a picture of the past that is far more grand and inspiring than the one found in standard textbooks. We see a humanity that has always been capable of greatness, a humanity that has survived multiple ends of the world to rise again. The Aztecs weren't just a local tribe that got lucky. They were the inheritors of a global tradition of excellence. They were the ones who kept the flame of the first sun alive, ensuring that even in the face of their own destruction, the code of the ancients would survive in the blood of their descendants. As we continue to unlock the secrets of our DNA, we are not just finding our ancestors. We are finding our way back to a forgotten version of ourselves. What do you think about these hidden genetic links? Should we keep digging into these lost civilizations? Or are some secrets better left buried in the past? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this mystery, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives. See you in the next one.